The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the streets of Riverside.
His sedan hummed softly as he adjusted the air conditioning, eager to shake off the lingering stress of the day. The radio played faintly in the background, a soothing counterpoint to the bustling city outside. As he approached a yellow light, Marcus slowed down, coming to a stop just as the light turned red. That's when the flashing blue and red lights appeared in his rearview mirror, accompanied by the sharp blare of a siren. Marcus glanced at the reflection, his brow furrowing slightly. He pulled over to the side of the road, rolling down his window as a police cruiser parked behind him. Out stepped Officer Derek Collins, a man in his mid-30s with a buzz cut and a badge that gleamed under the fading sunlight. Collins adjusted his belt as he approached Marcus's car, his posture radiating the confidence of someone accustomed to being in control. "License and registration," Collins said curtly, his voice flat but carrying an edge of authority. Marcus complied without a word, reaching into the glove compartment for his registration and handing over his driver's license. His movements were deliberate and calm, but he could feel Collins's eyes on him, scrutinizing him as if searching for something more than a routine traffic violation. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Collins asked, leaning slightly closer to the window. "I'm not entirely sure," Marcus replied evenly, his tone polite but firm. "You didn't come to a full stop at the light," Collins said, though there was a faint hesitation in his voice, as if he wasn't entirely convinced of his own reasoning. Marcus frowned, but nodded slightly. "I see. I thought I slowed down in time, but I understand." Collins didn't respond immediately. Instead, he blinked, his eyes narrowing as he studied Marcus more closely. It wasn't just a routine stop anymore, at least not for Collins. His posture shifted subtly, his demeanor hardening, as if he had already decided this was more than a simple traffic infraction. He glanced down at the license in his hand. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, his tone carrying a hint of suspicion. Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying, "I moved here a few months ago. My address is on the license." But Collins wasn't really listening. His questions were beginning to take on a sharper edge, just enough to suggest that his focus had shifted from the traffic violation to something else entirely. Marcus's calm demeanor seemed to irritate him, and he leaned in closer, his voice dropping slightly. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" "Just going home," Marcus replied, his tone steady, but the tension in the air was palpable. Collins didn't just see Marcus as a driver anymore. He saw something else, something that warranted suspicion. Marcus could sense the shift, but he didn't flinch. Little did Officer Collins know, the calm exterior wasn't naivety, it was control. This was just the beginning. Collins took a step back, folding Marcus's documents with an exaggerated slowness before tucking them into his chest pocket. He straightened up, his expression shifting into something faintly smug, as though he had already made up his mind about the man sitting in front of him. "Step out of the car for me," Collins ordered. Marcus's grip on the steering wheel tightened briefly, but his face betrayed no reaction. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" he asked, his tone measured. Collins's lips twitched, but he masked it quickly. "I asked you to step out of the car. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." The threat hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. Marcus exhaled slowly and opened the door. As he stepped out, Collins's eyes flicked over him, sizing him up. Marcus stood a little taller than the officer, his shoulders broad but his demeanor unthreatening. His tailored suit suggested professionalism. His polished shoes hinted at someone meticulous and careful. Yet none of that seemed to matter to Collins. He gestured toward the front of the car. "Hands where I can see them." Marcus complied, his movements calm and deliberate. "Is there something specific you're looking for, officer?" Collins smirked faintly. "Just routine. We've had some incidents around here. You can never be too careful." Marcus turned his head slightly, locking eyes with Collins. "Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans? Or does this have more to do with something else?" The question landed like a punch, and for a moment, Collins's composure faltered. He straightened up, his hand drifting toward his belt more out of reflex than necessity. "Watch your tone," he said, his voice hardening. "I'm simply asking a question. There was no defiance in his voice, just a quiet firmness that seemed to unsettle the officer. Collins leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "You seem awfully familiar with how this works. You got something to hide?" Marcus let the silence stretch for a beat before answering. "No, officer. I just believe in being clear about the reasons for an interaction like this. Transparency, you know." Collins scoffed but didn't reply. He stepped back, pacing a small circle in front of the car. The dynamic was shifting in ways he couldn't quite grasp. Marcus wasn't reacting the way most people would. There was no fear, no stammering, no nervous fidgeting. Instead, there was control, poise, and an unsettling calm that put Collins on edge. "You seem pretty confident," Collins muttered, almost to himself. "Like you think you know what's going to happen next." Marcus didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he tilted his head slightly. "Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is." Collins froze for half a second before turning back to face him. The smirk was gone now, replaced by something sharper, almost defensive. He opened his mouth to reply, but the words didn't come out. Marcus's composure was throwing him off balance, and he didn't like it. As the silence stretched, the tension between them felt electric, and Collins was starting to realize this wasn't going to play out the way he'd expected. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. The real test was about to begin. Collins tapped his fingers against the holster on his belt, his frustration barely concealed. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who looked like Marcus. His gaze flicked back to the sedan, as though searching for a justification he hadn't yet manufactured. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," Collins said, his voice clipped. "I need to check for weapons." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Weapons?" he repeated, his tone incredulous, but still measured. "Do I look like someone who's carrying a weapon?" Collins's jaw tightened, and for a moment his composure cracked. "I'm not going to ask you again." Marcus hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable passing across his face. Then, without a word, he turned and placed his palms flat against the hood of his car. Collins approached, the crunch of his boots on the asphalt breaking the uneasy silence. The officer patted Marcus down in quick, less rough movements, his hands lingering a little longer than necessary. It wasn't just a search, it was an attempt to assert dominance, to provoke a reaction. But Marcus didn't flinch, didn't stiffen, didn't so much as shift under the invasive scrutiny. "You're clean," Collins muttered, stepping back. The admission sounded begrudging, like he was irritated that he hadn't found anything to justify his suspicion. Marcus turned to face him, his expression calm, but his eyes sharp. "Of course I am," he said simply. "Now, officer, if you're done." "I'm not done," Collins interrupted, his voice rising slightly. The words tumbled out too quickly, betraying his need to stay in control. "You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do. Care to explain why?" Marcus folded his arms, his posture relaxed despite the tension crackling between them. "I've had my fair share of interactions with law enforcement," he said. "Let's just say I've learned a lot over the years." Collins's eyes narrowed. "So you a lawyer or something?" Marcus smiled faintly. "Or something." The ambiguity in his answer seemed to irritate Collins further. He stepped closer, invading Marcus's personal space, his voice dropping to a near growl. "Listen, you think you're smarter than me? Think you can talk your way out of this?" Marcus met his gaze evenly, unflinching. "I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness, and so far I'm not seeing much of it here." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Collins took the bait. "Fairness? You think fairness is what this is about? People like you always." He stopped himself abruptly, the words lingering like smoke even though they hadn't fully escaped. Marcus's expression didn't change, but something about his posture shifted, a subtle but unmistakable signal that he'd caught exactly what Collins had left unsaid. "People like me?" Marcus repeated, his voice soft but charged with meaning. Collins bristled, stepping back as if realizing he'd just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. "You know what I mean," he muttered, though his tone lacked the conviction it had moments earlier. "I think I do," Marcus replied quietly. His calmness wasn't passive anymore. It was razor sharp, cutting through the pretense like a blade. "And I think we both know this interaction stopped being about a traffic violation a long time ago." Collins opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. For the first time, he looked uncertain, like he wasn't entirely sure how to proceed. The balance of power was shifting, and for the first time, Collins was on shaky ground. But the moment of reckoning was still to come, and it would be one he'd never forget. Marcus's voice broke the heavy silence, steady and unyielding. "Officer, I think it's time you know who I am." Collins's brows knitted, his irritation resurfacing. "I don't care who you are," he shot back, though the faint crack in his tone suggested otherwise. Marcus reached into his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. "I'm reaching for my badge," he said calmly, watching Collins's hand twitch near his holster. "No need for theatrics. I want you to see it." The words hung in the air, weighted with something unspoken. Collins's eyes followed Marcus's hand as he pulled out a leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing a gleaming badge. "Marcus Hayes?" Marcus said, his tone as casual as if he were introducing himself to a neighbor. "Head of Internal Affairs, Riverside Division." Collins froze. His eyes darted to the badge, then back to Marcus's face, searching for some sign that this was a joke. But there was no humor in Marcus's expression, only quiet authority and a hint of disappointment. "Internal Affairs?" Collins repeated, his voice cracking slightly. "Yes?" Marcus interrupted, saving him the trouble of finishing the thought. "I oversee officer conduct. My job is to ensure that the people wearing this badge uphold the integrity and values it's meant to represent." Collins's face paled, his confident demeanor unraveling in real time. He took a small step back, his hand falling away from his belt as though the weight of his own authority had suddenly become too heavy. Marcus took a step forward, closing the gap Collins had instinctively created. "Do you know what the most troubling part of this interaction has been, Officer Collins?" he asked, his voice calm but piercing. Collins didn't answer. He looked like a man who had just realized he'd walked into quicksand and had no idea how to escape it. "It's not the profiling," Marcus continued, "though that's bad enough. It's not the baseless escalation either. It's the fact that you've done all of this without even realizing who you were talking to. You assumed that I wouldn't know my rights, that I wouldn't understand the laws you're sworn to uphold. And why?" Collins opened his mouth, but no words came. Marcus's gaze bore into him, unrelenting. "Because I didn't fit your idea of someone deserving respect," Marcus finished for him. His words weren't angry, but they carried the weight of an indictment. "And that's not just a problem for me, officer. That's a problem for everyone you encounter in this uniform." Collins's shoulders sagged slightly, the full weight of Marcus's words landing squarely on him. He glanced down at the badge in Marcus's hand again, as if it might somehow disappear if he didn't look too closely. Marcus stepped back, giving Collins a moment to breathe, but his voice didn't lose its edge. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to take a step back, return my documents, and think very carefully about what you say next." Collins's lips parted, but he hesitated, clearly debating whether to push back or comply. The hesitation cost him, and then Marcus added, his voice lowering slightly. "You're going to hear from me again, not as a driver you stopped on the side of the road, but as the man tasked with deciding whether you're fit to wear that badge." Collins swallowed hard, his face paling as the weight of the moment sank in. He reached into his chest pocket and pulled out Marcus's license and registration, his hands trembling slightly as he handed them over. Marcus took them without a word, tucking them into his wallet. He stepped toward the driver's side door of his car, pausing with one hand on the handle. He looked over his shoulder, meeting Collins's gaze one last time. "Remember this, Officer Collins," Marcus said. "The badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone." As Marcus slid back into his car and started the engine, Collins was left standing in the fading light, his confidence shaken and his future uncertain. But for Marcus, this was far from over. His next move would ripple through the entire department. The drive home was quiet, but Marcus's mind was anything but. The encounter played over in his head, not because it was unique, but because it wasn't. Collins wasn't the first officer Marcus had dealt with like this, and he knew he wouldn't be the last. But this time, things would be different. This time, Marcus had the authority to act. The next morning, Marcus sat at his desk, the early sunlight streaming through the blinds of his office at the Riverside Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. A file sat open in front of him. Officer Derek Collins. His record wasn't spotless. Minor complaints of unprofessional conduct, excessive stops, and vague misunderstandings that had never been properly addressed. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he thought about the broader implications. Collins wasn't an anomaly, he was a symptom of a deeper problem. And Marcus wasn't interested in putting a bandage on a bullet wound. A knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. His assistant, Karen, stepped in, holding a stack of reports. "Morning, Mr. Hayes. I've got the summary on last month's misconduct cases. Also, Chief Reynolds wanted me to remind you about the department review next week." Marcus nodded, taking the files from her. "Thanks, Karen. Can you also schedule a meeting with Chief Reynolds for this afternoon? There's something I need to discuss with him." Karen hesitated, sensing the weight in Marcus's tone. "Of course," she said before slipping out of the room. Marcus turned his attention back to Collins's file, but his focus wasn't just on the officer. This was bigger than one man and one interaction. It was about the culture that allowed someone like Collins to feel justified in his behavior. And if there was one thing Marcus knew, it was that culture started at the top. Later that afternoon, Marcus sat across from Chief Reynolds in a conference room. Reynolds, a seasoned veteran with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, leaned back in his chair, listening intently as Marcus recounted the traffic stop. "I could have written it off as just another bad interaction," Marcus said, his voice steady but resolute. "But that would have been a mistake. Collins's behavior isn't an isolated incident. It's a reflection of how much work we still have to do." Reynolds rubbed his temples, exhaling slowly. "This isn't the first time Collins's name has come up," he admitted, "but we've always handled it internally, quietly." "And that's the problem," Marcus replied. "Quiet doesn't fix anything. Quiet lets it keep happening. It's time to be loud." Reynolds looked at him, the weight of the conversation etched into his face. "What are you proposing?" "A department-wide review," Marcus said without hesitation. "Not just of individual officers, but of our training, our protocols, our accountability systems. We can't keep sweeping this under the rug. If we don't hold ourselves to a higher standard, how can we expect the community to trust us?" Reynolds leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "You're going to ruffle some feathers with this." "Good," Marcus said simply. "It's about time someone did." The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and reports. Marcus worked tirelessly, compiling data, speaking with officers, and holding public forums to hear directly from the community. The Collins incident became a catalyst for change, a turning point that forced the department to confront its flaws head-on. Collins, for his part, faced an internal hearing. Marcus made no secret of his involvement, sitting across from Collins during the proceedings and watching as the officer squirmed under the scrutiny. The hearing resulted in a suspension, but Marcus knew the real victory wasn't in punishing Collins. It was in preventing the next Collins. Months later, Marcus stood at the podium of a community event, addressing a room full of officers, city officials, and local residents. He spoke not of blame, but of responsibility, of the shared duty to create a system that worked for everyone. His words weren't just a call for accountability, they were a promise of change. "Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys, Marcus said, his voice resonating through the hall. It's about making sure the people sworn to protect and serve do so with